This video guide will accompany the web version of the Guide to Punctuation and Sentence Structure. And it really focuses on 5 things that punctuation helps you do. And as this guide talks about, there's a close connection between punctuation and our voice. It's really through punctuation that we infuse into our writing what we might say are the 3-dimensional qualities of the human voice. If you know a little bit about sentence structure, it helps as well. So I'm going to review the 5 things punctuation helps you do, and then look at some examples of punctuation being used in text. So the first thing that punctuation helps you do is to connect sentences or independent clauses. And you can do it only 2 ways. The first way is with a comma and a coordinate conjunction. The easy way to remember these connector words are the acronym FANBOYS, the for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So the comma and the conjunction are what are needed to connect, and you need both. If you only have one comma, it's not enough, and only conjunction, that's not enough. The second way to connect complete thoughts or sentences is with a semicolon. And the semicolon is kind of like a fulcrum there. The 2 sides are related to each other. And you can easily test if you've used these correctly as if it's a sentence on each side. The second thing that punctuation helps you do is to separate what we might call introductory elements. It's kind of a broad category, but it includes transition words, phrases, dependent clauses. That's a complex sentence there. And you can hear the pause really clearly. However, we will meet the public's demands. In the morning, the usual routine is to eat by 8 o'clock. And you can hear that comma. After the shower in the morning, pause. The first thing I do is get some coffee. This is the most frequent error that people make, leaving commas off introductory elements. So look out for these in your writing. The third thing punctuation helps you do is to separate, again, what we might broadly call interrupting elements. There are other grammatical names for these things like appositives, but interrupting element is a good descriptor. They're extra, non-essential information that is thrown in the middle of the sentence. And you can pull it out of the sentence, and the sentence still reads as a complete thought. And you've got 3 options, or 3 ways in which you can separate this interrupting element, either with a pair of commas, a pair of dashes, or parentheses. And as you can see in the examples, the 3 different ways to do it. You can definitely hear the change in pitch and tone of the voice around that interrupting element. George Washington, our first president, liked to chop down trees. If I knew where to go, which I don't, then we wouldn't be lost. You can definitely hear that change in voice. So one of the tests here is you can pull that phrase or that word or whatever out and look at the sentence and see if it still reads clearly and well. Then maybe you've got an interrupting element. Say it out loud, and do you hear that change in tone, change in voice around it? The fourth thing that punctuation helps you do is to separate items in a list. And the one you're probably familiar with and do fine is with commas. I went to the store and bought eggs, comma, milk, comma, and butter. You may or may not know that the last comma, the comma between the last 2 items, is optional. It's called the Oxford comma, and I tend to put it in just to make sure there's no ambiguity, but it is optional and you could leave it off. You could also separate items in a list with semicolons, and this is only in the special case where an item in the list is long enough to have a comma inside it. See, this is a compound adjective, and there's a comma there. So if I was using commas to separate the items in a list, there may be confusion. Where does the item begin? Where does the item end? Is this a new item? So the semicolons help clarify those divisions between items. The fifth thing that punctuation helps you do is a little bit more ambiguous, but it really is about pointing in the sense, pointing your reader's attention to what you wish to highlight. The sense here is that the first half of the sentence sets up something that the second half of the sentence completes. And that might be an example, an explanation, some kind of significant word or phrase. And you can do this pointing and setting up in two different ways, either with a colon, my house is a mess, and here comes a list about the house. Here's a concluding statement. There's one hope for our team, colon, we need to win. But you can do the same thing with a dash. There's one hope for our team, we need to win. Sometimes we forget what Hamlet was asked to do. Murder. So dashes really do kind of they're a little bit more emotional, maybe a little rounder than colons. Which one you use is a matter of your style, but they really can help you get that voice as you're setting up some kind of concluding statement. So those are the 5 things that punctuation helps you do. There's a lot more complex things with punctuation, but these really cover some of the most basic things that we do when we write. And learning these 5 things can really help you to learn to punctuate really well. So let's look at some illustrations and examples of punctuation. So here's a passage, and I've underlined some examples. Okay, let me get the right. Here we go. So I was 4 years old, but I can still remember that day. So that's a sentence, right? I was 4 years old. I can still remember that day. And I'm connecting them with the comma and the conjunction. So this is the first function, connecting sentences. Here, being the only girl, my dolls were more than my toys. They were my friends. So that's an introductory element. So this one is a number 2, comma after introductory element. Here we've got a semicolon. And we can kind of test it. Is it a sentence on each side? Because semicolons help us to put together 2 sentences. And it is. It's working kind of like a fulcrum there between those 2 statements. So that number 3 is a number 1. So I may not do all of these. Let me kind of skip around. Her face was like a party plate, and her eyes were like 2 chocolate cookies rounded by big eyelashes. So there's a conjunction and a comma. Is it a sentence on each side? And it is. So we've got another example of using a comma and a conjunction to connect sentences. Let's do one more sentence here. She had a big smile that made her cheeks look like 2 strawberries. What child doesn't want to see a dessert every day? And her dress was blue as the sky. So here we've got an interrupting element, right? So it's 3. Using parentheses to separate an interrupting element. Here's a comma and connecting 2 sentences. So this person is punctuating pretty well. So let's go down a little bit down here. When we returned, I hurriedly went to the living room to see Carlotta, but she was not there. So right here, the real sentence starts with this I. I hurriedly went. And what comes before is introductory. It begins with a subordinate conjunction, when we returned. So this is a number 2, where it's a comma after introductory element. This is a sentence. I hurriedly went. She was not there. And we're putting it together with the comma and the conjunction. So that's another example of 1. I started getting nervous, colon. I looked under the sofa, but I saw darkness. So it looks like this colon there is setting up this little looking scene. So 16 is an example of number 5. We're pointing with that colon. And here again, we've got a connection of a complete thought. So we've looked at an example of someone that's punctuating pretty well. Let's see a little rougher passage. Okay. Is it going to let me move things a little bit? How don't you get out of the way? All right, well, the one story that really stood out to me was when she was a little girl, her and her brothers would play on her parents' farm down in Mexico. When they were about 12 years of old age, their father was starting to teach. There's something going on like right in here. And what's there's one subordinate conjunction there and another one. What stood out to me was when, and so do we keep this when with this side, or is it a sentence break? So when they were about 12 years of age, comma, introductory element, their father was starting to teach their older brother to drive his truck. I kind of like that approach. We could have kept it and made this a period after age, but we'll put a period and make it a capital W. Now right here though, we've got a problem because it's a sentence on this side. As memory recalls, it was a black Chevy, so he could help move hay bales too. So that's a sentence on this way. So all we've got connecting these sentences is this comma. And a comma can't connect two sentences. So let's go ahead and divide it. Let's just put a period, start a new sentence, and we fixed that, what's called a comma splice. This looks okay if we're connecting sentences with a comma. So he could help move hay bales to from the farm. That's a sentence. It was a black Chevy. That's a sentence. So we've connected two sentences correctly there. It was a sizzling day on their farm, and their father, or Papa, went into town to get something. So you can hear how the voice changed, right? But we have no signaling in the punctuation. It's an interrupting element. We could pull it out, and it still reads. It was a sizzling day on the farm, and her father went into town. So I'm going to use commas to separate this interrupting element. And that's an example of 3, right? The third thing that punctuation helps you do. Now here we've got another comma, and it looks like there's sentences on each side. Oh, let's look here. How about this comma? It was a sizzling day on the farm. That's a sentence. Her father went to town. That's a sentence. So we're missing the comma. So that's number 1. And her father went to town, that's a sentence. Her brother took the truck, that's a sentence. Let's just separate it with a period. Start. And this looks like we can put a comma after a little introductory. Well, her brother took the other truck they had and decided that he had driven before, so he is a good driver now. Now let's look at this and. So it's a comma and. Is it a sentence on each side? Well, her brother took the truck they had. That looks like it's a sentence. But after this part, decided that he had driven before is not a sentence. So we're not connecting sentences. A conjunction connects, coordinate conjunction, grammatically similar things. So it could be, in this case, 2 verbs. Brother took and decided. So we don't need the comma there. So you don't always need a comma in front of the and or but. But here, we do need it because this comma and conjunction is connecting two sentences. All right, so that ends this little video reviewing the guide to sentence structure and punctuation. You know, there's a lot more complex things to punctuation, but really learning these 5 things will help you to punctuate correctly in a very significant way.